Hey everyone, welcome back to Unfolded Lives. Today we're diving into the story of one of history's most fascinating figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. Depending on who you ask, he was either a brilliant hero or a dangerous villain. Either way, one thing is for sure, he changed the world. So sit back and relax. By the end of this story, you'll not only know Napoleon better, but you might also see leadership, ambition, and power in a totally different light. Let's start at the beginning. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, on the island of Corsica, a rugged, mountainous place in the Mediterranean that had recently become part of France. His family wasn't wealthy, though they came from minor nobility. His dad, Carlo Bonaparte, worked as a lawyer and did his best to support the family, but he was often away. That left young Napoleon especially close to his mother, Letizia. She was tough, fiercely protective, and made sure her children got a solid education. Growing up, Napoleon was a serious, stubborn kid. People teased him for being short. He stood around 5 feet 6 inches, which was below average for a Frenchman at the time. But that only lit a fire inside him. He hated being underestimated, and it gave him something to prove. From early on, he believed he was destined for something great. He just had to work for it. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend a military academy. Imagine being a small kid, far from home, surrounded by strangers who didn't talk like you. His Corsican accent made him a target. He was isolated, mocked, and often lonely. But instead of retreating into himself, he leaned into his studies. He excelled in subjects like math, which later became critical to his skills in military strategy. By the time he was 16, he graduated and joined the French army as a second lieutenant. This was right when France was descending into chaos. The French Revolution was beginning, and the country was turning upside down. It was a time of intense political unrest and brutal power struggles. Napoleon saw this chaos not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He had a vision for France. He didn't just want power for the sake of it. He dreamed of a unified, powerful nation, one that stood proud and strong. He wanted to be the one to guide it there. But at first, life in the army wasn't easy. Officers looked down on him because he was Corsican and short. He faced dangerous missions and tough battles. Still, he never backed down. He studied endlessly: tactics, history, leadership. He was constantly thinking about how to make France stronger. He wasn't just in the army, he was preparing to lead it. At just 20 years old, Napoleon got his first big break. Promoted to captain, he was given command in a campaign in Italy. The French were outnumbered, outgunned, and morale was low. By the age of 24, he had already been promoted to general. That's right, just 24 years old, and already one of the most powerful men in the army. His meteoric rise was no accident. He had earned every bit of it. But his climb to power wasn't just about the battlefield. Around this time, Napoleon met someone who had changed his life forever: Josephine de Beauharnais. Josephine was a widow with 2 children. She was 6 years older than Napoleon and known throughout Paris for her charm, beauty, and sophistication. Napoleon, still in his 20s, was instantly captivated. He fell hard and fast. He showered her with love letters, many of which are still read today for their raw emotion and poetic tone. Here's a line from one of them. "Since I left you, I have been constantly sad. My happiness is to be near you. My thoughts drift to you, my beloved. I love you more each day, and I long for your touch." It's clear, he was head over heels. But Josephine didn't feel the same intensity. At first, she didn't even take him seriously. He was younger, not yet famous, and not wealthy. But Napoleon was persistent. Eventually, he won her over, and they married in 1796. 2 days later, he had to leave her to lead a major campaign in Italy. Now, this is where Napoleon really started to shine. The French army in Italy was in terrible shape: low morale, little food, and barely any weapons. Previous commanders had failed to inspire the troops. But Napoleon walked in with energy, clarity, and confidence. He gave rousing speeches, made bold decisions, and moved faster than the enemy could react. His tactics were sharp and unexpected. Between 1796 and 1797, he pulled off a string of stunning victories. At the Battle of Lodi, he charged across a heavily defended bridge under enemy fire. At Arcole, he led the charge himself, grabbing a flag and racing ahead to inspire his men. And at Rivoli, he decisively defeated the Austrians. These victories didn't just make headlines, they made him a national hero. France saw him as a military genius. His soldiers adored him. But back home, things weren't so perfect. While Napoleon was fighting and thinking of Josephine, she had begun an affair. When he found out, he was crushed, but he forgave her. His love for her ran deep, and for now, he wasn't ready to let her go. After Italy, Napoleon was handed a new mission: Egypt. Why Egypt? Simple. Britain was France's biggest rival, and Britain's power depended on its trade routes, especially with India. Egypt was a key link in that chain. Napoleon wanted to cut it off. In 1798, at just 28 years old, he set sail with not only an army, but a group of scientists and scholars. This wasn't just a war, it was a cultural mission. He wanted to bring French ideas, science, and enlightenment to the Middle East. In the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon faced off against the Mamluks, Egypt's ruling warriors. The Mamluks were fierce, but stuck in the past, using outdated methods. Napoleon's forces were modern and strategic, and they crushed the Mamluks. Cairo welcomed him as a conqueror, but victory didn't last long. While he was busy in Egypt, the British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, attacked and destroyed Napoleon's fleet in the Battle of the Nile. Now, Napoleon and his men were trapped. Still, he didn't panic. He saw another opportunity. Back in France, the government was crumbling. Corruption, infighting, and economic chaos had made people desperate for strong leadership. Napoleon quietly left Egypt. Yes, he left his army behind and returned to Paris. When he arrived, it was clear. This was his moment. On November 9th, 1799, he led a coup d'etat. In other words, he overthrew the government by force. He took control and made himself first consul, the most powerful man in France. He was just 30 years old. And he didn't stop there. Once in power, Napoleon immediately started reshaping France. He overhauled the economy, stabilized the currency, and established a new legal system called the Napoleonic Code, one of his most lasting achievements. This code influenced laws not only in France, but all around the world. He built new schools, promoted education, and rewarded merit over class or birth. It was a modern vision of leadership, and people loved him for it. Then, on December 2nd, 1804, in a grand ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France. Yes, you heard that right. He didn't let the Pope place the crown on his head. At the last second, Napoleon took the crown and crowned himself. It was symbolic. He wanted to show that his power didn't come from God or tradition. It came from himself. And standing beside him was Josephine, now crowned empress. But as with all things in Napoleon's life, success would come with its share of problems and enemies. With the crown on his head and France at his feet, Napoleon Bonaparte had finally reached the height of power. But power, real power, always brings problems, especially when the rest of Europe is watching and trembling. As soon as he became emperor, other nations started to worry. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia saw Napoleon as a rising threat. And to be fair, he absolutely was. He didn't just want France to be strong. He wanted a French empire that would stretch across Europe. Britain was his biggest rival. Their navy ruled the seas, and they had the money and alliances to stand against him. But Napoleon had something else: land strategy. He focused on the battlefield. In 1805, the Austrians and Russians joined forces to stop him. Together, their armies totaled nearly 100,000 soldiers. Napoleon had just 68,000. But he didn't panic. He used one of his most brilliant tactics ever. He made his army look weak, like they were in retreat. The enemy believed it. They charged forward, thinking they had the upper hand, but it was a trap. At the perfect moment, Napoleon struck from the sides and center. It became one of the most decisive victories in military history. The Battle of Austerlitz. Over 36,000 Austrian and Russian soldiers were either killed or captured. The Austrian emperor was forced to surrender, and Napoleon became the undisputed master of Europe. He praised his soldiers. "You have won the love of France. This is one of the greatest victories in history." And his troops adored him. They believed he couldn't be beaten. But there was one problem: Britain. Napoleon couldn't defeat them in a straight-up battle. So he turned to economic warfare. In 1806, he launched the Continental System, a policy that banned all European countries under his control from trading with Britain. The idea was to ruin Britain's economy by isolating it. But things didn't go as planned. Many countries secretly continued trading with the British. Even French businesses suffered, unable to get supplies. Instead of hurting Britain, the system backfired and weakened parts of Napoleon's own empire. Still, his military momentum continued. In 1806, Napoleon crushed the Prussians at the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt. The Prussian king was forced to surrender, and once again, Napoleon expanded his reach. Next, it was Russia's turn. Russia was tough: massive land, brutal winters, and fearless soldiers. But Napoleon wasn't afraid. In 1807, he defeated the Russians at the Battle of Friedland. Tsar Alexander I had no choice but to sign a peace treaty. At this point, almost all of continental Europe was under Napoleon's control. He was at his peak. His empire stretched from Spain to Poland. France was the most powerful nation on the continent. He was a living legend. But even legends have personal struggles. Despite all his victories, Napoleon still lacked one crucial thing: an heir. Josephine, the woman he loved deeply, had never given him a child. And for an emperor, not having a successor was a big problem. Dynasties need continuity. His empire needed a future. So, in 1809, he made a heartbreaking decision. He divorced Josephine. They both wept. Napoleon later said, "Josephine, you were the only woman I truly loved." But duty came first. In 1810, he married Marie-Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of the Austrian emperor. Napoleon was 41. It was a political marriage meant to strengthen ties with Austria, and it worked. A year later, in 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, Napoleon II. The emperor was overjoyed. He finally had an heir. France finally had a crown prince. But just as things seemed to be settling down, Napoleon made the worst decision of his life. He invaded Russia. Here's the backstory. Russia had been ignoring the continental system, and Napoleon saw it as betrayal. So, in 1812, he gathered an army of 600,000 men, the largest Europe had ever seen, and marched toward Moscow. At first, the Russians avoided direct battle. Instead, they retreated and used a brutal strategy: scorched earth. They burned crops, destroyed towns, and left nothing behind. Napoleon's army couldn't find food. Supplies ran low, and then winter came. And if you know anything about Russian winters, they don't play around. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees C. Horses froze standing. Soldiers died by the thousands, some from starvation, others from the cold, and many from disease. By the time Napoleon retreated back to France, he had lost over 500,000 soldiers. It was the beginning of the end. Europe saw its chance. After Russia, a new alliance formed against him: the Sixth Coalition. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Spain, all united. Napoleon rushed to raise a new army. But this time, it wasn't the experienced veterans of the past. These were young recruits, poorly trained, inspired but not prepared. Still, he stood strong. In October 1813, Napoleon faced the coalition at Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations. He had 200,000 soldiers. The coalition had 350,000. It was the largest battle Europe had seen before World War I. Napoleon's strategy was brilliant, as always. But this time, it wasn't enough. His troops were surrounded. Worse, some of his own allies, like the Saxons, switched sides mid-battle, turning against him. It was a disaster. During the retreat, a bridge was destroyed too early, stranding thousands of French soldiers. Many drowned or were captured. Napoleon watched in horror. By the end, he had lost 80,000 men. France was no longer invincible. The coalition invaded France in 1814. They marched into Paris, and the people, once cheering his name, had grown tired of war and suffering. His own generals came to him and said, "Emperor, we can't fight anymore. It's over." And Napoleon, heartbroken, abdicated the throne. After 20 years of rising through the ranks, conquering Europe, but his enemies didn't execute him. Instead, they exiled him to a tiny island off the coast of Italy called Elba. And just like that, the man who had once commanded an empire was now the ruler of a small island with barely 1,000 residents. As he boarded the ship, he looked back and said, "France, I have given you everything, and now I must leave you." It seemed like the end. But Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't the kind of man to go quietly. Just 10 months later, he heard something that changed everything. The new king of France, Louis XVIII, was deeply unpopular. People missed Napoleon. The army still loved him. So in a bold move that shocked the world, Napoleon escaped from Elba. With just 1,000 loyal men, he landed on the southern coast of France and started marching north. The king sent an army to stop him. When the soldiers saw Napoleon, he walked in front of them, opened his coat, and said, "If any of you want to shoot your emperor, here I am." Not a single shot was fired. The army joined him. Within 20 days, Napoleon returned to Paris and took back the throne. It was one of the most dramatic comebacks in history. But his return would only last 100 days. The coalition was furious. They didn't want to fight him again, but they couldn't ignore the threat, so they gathered their forces for one final confrontation. That final showdown would take place in a small Belgian village called Waterloo. It all came down to this: one last battle, one last grasp for glory. After defying the odds and returning from exile, after marching across France with nothing but a handful of loyal soldiers and the sheer weight of his legend, Napoleon once again stood at the center of history. But this time, the world had learned its lesson. The kings and emperors of Europe weren't going to give him another chance. The moment he set foot in France and took back power, they acted swiftly, decisively, and together. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, the great powers of the continent, united once more, not just to stop a man, but to end a myth. Napoleon knew the odds. He knew time wasn't on his side. He knew the coalition forces would grow stronger with each passing day. So, true to his nature, he struck first. He gathered what remained of France's army. 72,000 men, many of them young, inexperienced, but still inspired by the shadow of past glories, and marched north to intercept his enemies before they could fully unite. His plan was simple: break the British under the Duke of Wellington before the Prussians could arrive, divide and conquer as he had done so many times before. He believed in speed, precision, surprise. He believed in himself. And so, on June 1815, just outside the quiet village of Waterloo in Belgium, the final act of Napoleon's military career began. The night before, a torrential downpour had turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. Cannons sank into the ground, horses struggled for footing, infantry moved like they were wading through thick glue. Still, Napoleon pressed on. He launched attack after attack, pushing the British lines back, pounding them with artillery when possible, sending in cavalry charges to break their resolve. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like it might work. Like maybe, just maybe, he would turn back time. But the mud slowed him down. His artillery, normally the backbone of his assault, was neutralized. And then the worst possible news arrived. The Prussians were here. Blücher's army had arrived on Napoleon's right flank. The trap had closed. Now Napoleon's men were not just facing Wellington, they were surrounded, outnumbered, exhausted. And as the day wore on and dusk began to fall, the battlefield was covered in the bodies of thousands. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, the most elite force in his army, made a final stand. But even they, the most feared soldiers in Europe, broke. They never had before. By evening, the battle was lost. Napoleon rode from the field not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen the end of a dream. His final chance at empire, at redemption, had vanished in the mud and blood of Waterloo. In the days that followed, Napoleon attempted to rally political support, to form a new government, to perhaps fight once more. But it was over. The French people were weary. His allies had deserted him. Paris no longer welcomed him as a savior. So he did what he had never done before. He surrendered, this time to the British. But the British had no intention of repeating past mistakes. They weren't going to exile him to another nearby island where he might return again with the force of legend and charisma. No, this time, they chose a place so remote, so isolated. It might as well have been on the moon, a speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, St. Helena. And there he was sent. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once ruled over the greatest empire in Europe, now reduced to a prisoner on a lonely island, watched day and night, surrounded by an endless ocean and silence. At first, he tried to remain active. He dictated his memoirs, writing page after page about his victories, his vision for France, and his perspective on what had gone wrong. He wanted to control the narrative, to tell history, not just what had happened, but why. He spoke to the few followers who had stayed with him, men who still called him emperor, who still believed he had been robbed of his destiny. He told stories of Egypt, of Austerlitz, of the great marches through snow and smoke. But slowly, his body began to betray him. He suffered from chronic stomach pain. He grew thin. His once thick, dark hair began to fall out. He could no longer ride, barely walked, and spent his days wandering the barren hills of the island, or sitting alone, staring out at the sea that now defined the boundaries of his world. Sometimes, in moments of clarity and reflection, he would say, "I was born on an island, and I will die on one." And he was right. On May 5th, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte, aged 51, died. His final words, "France, the army, head of the army, Josephine," were quiet echoes of everything he had loved, everything he had lost. The British buried him on St. Helena beneath a simple stone. But his wish had always been different. He had told his closest companions, "If they will allow it, I want to be buried on the banks of the Seine, among the people of France whom I loved so much." That wish would take 19 years to fulfill. By 1840, the winds of history had shifted once again. France had changed, and the people, who once turned away from the fallen emperor, now remembered the man, the legend. They demanded his return. And so, King Louis Philippe ordered that Napoleon's remains be brought back to Paris. The journey home was nothing short of royal. As the golden carriage carrying his coffin made its way through the streets of the capital, thousands lined the roads. They cheered, they wept, they shouted once more, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor!" He was finally laid to rest at Les Invalides, under a magnificent dome, in a tomb carved from red quartzite and surrounded by marble statues of victory, a resting place fit not just for a general or a king, but for a man who had shaped history itself. So what do we make of all this? What can we learn from a life as dramatic, as contradictory, as epic as Napoleon's? He was a man who rose from almost nothing. He was mocked as a child, dismissed as an outsider, told again and again that he was too small, too strange, too Corsican to ever lead. And yet, he became emperor. He built an empire not just through war, but through law, education, and vision. The Napoleonic Code, which reformed the legal system, still influences laws around the world today. He modernized Europe. He gave power to the middle class. He rewarded talent over birthright. But he was also consumed by ambition. He reached too far. He believed in his own myth. And that belief, so powerful, so inspiring, is also what brought him down. He underestimated the Russian winter. He overextended in Spain. He alienated allies. And in the end, he lost everything. And yet, he never gave up, even in defeat, even in exile. He kept moving, kept thinking, kept trying. Because for Napoleon, his life leaves us with deep, difficult questions. Was he a hero or a tyrant? A liberator or a dictator? A visionary or a madman? Maybe he was all of those things. What's undeniable is this: Napoleon Bonaparte changed the world. He changed the way wars were fought. He changed the way countries were governed. He changed the course of history, and even in death, he refused to be forgotten. And now, the question is yours to answer. Was Napoleon a hero or a villain? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if this story made you see history in a new way, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the lives that shaped our world. Until next time, thanks for watching.